Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, second attempt. Good afternoon. Welcome again to the NITheCS Colloquium. And now I can see my laptop in the background. Okay, sorry, third attempt. No, it is a great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Priyanka Nagar. She's a local hero, yeah, from the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Sciences in Stellenbosch. And she's also heavily involved in one of the research focus areas of NITheCS around data science and machine learning in general. I don't remember now the exact name because it's a very
long name.
Long name, yeah. But anyway, she's involved in the, let's call them machine learning, AI, data science efforts of NITheCS in a coordinating role. So we are very happy that today she took the time to tell us something about not computational thinking, but nonlinear thinking. Yeah, so we are very happy for you to be here, and we are really looking forward to your talk, Priyanka. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So the title of my talk today is Beyond Linear Thinking, Statistical Approaches for Directional Data. I myself am a statistician, so the focus on this is going to be from a statistics point of view, how we consider observations and data that doesn't necessarily follow the norm of everything we've been taught in school, in varsity, in practice on how to work with observations that we encounter. Right. So the outline, we're going to start with a bit of background in terms of the motivation for this area that we will refer to as directional statistics, why it exists, what is the purpose of it, and how we define data that does not conform to linear thinking per se. And once we have a better idea of that, it's always nice to find out and just see where and how this concept and this idea came from and who motivated the use of these techniques. So we'll have a look at a short history on where the field originated, why it originated, and where it's sort of heading in terms of the next few decades. Thereafter, we'll have a look at a little bit more of the theory behind it, what makes it special, how do we consider different techniques and approaches within this field, and then we'll look at some research contributions of projects that I've been involved in that are interesting in terms of they're data-driven, they've originated for some application that we've had a look at, and we were fortunate enough to not just apply something that exists, but develop some new statistical contribution as well. Right, so data as we know it, when we have observations, the question comes in is if we have observations and data that are, for example, from a compass or a clock, immediately by just looking at these two pictures, we get this idea that there is no start and end. If you consider any point, any fixed point, and move around that fixed point, you end up back at the same place you've started. With a clock as well, we know you're right with time twice a day, because it has this periodic, this looping effect that we observe. With the compass as well, we start with north. If we consider that at a point and we move around, we end up back at the same starting point. So when we have this type of data, the clock, for example, quite easily, time data, time series, we know we have time series in statistics, but another way in which we can consider these observations is by considering it from a periodic point of view in terms of a directional observation. A compass as well. Easy examples of that is if you're tracking wind direction or some sort of pattern in terms of an orientation. Another very famous application or motivation that is intuitive is since the beginning of time, we're interested in migration patterns, be it movement of animals, movement of humans, etc. When these species move around, we're interested in behavioral patterns, be it to better understand ecosystems or for preservation of resources, etc. So animal movement is also quite a big application area for this sort of techniques. Right, so for the remainder of this talk, whenever I refer to observations or data, I will specifically refer to directional data. So these are essentially any observations that have a periodic phenomena attached to them, some sort of cyclic nature or pattern that is repeated. Okay. When we have a data observation that is an angle, we're usually interested in the direction associated and not necessarily the magnitude if we conceptualize a directional observation as a unit vector. Right, so question comes in now is, okay, if I have a straight line, right? If I'm in the usual setting of statistics, linear values as we know them, if I ask you to picture the number 10 and -5, right? Immediately in our minds, we have a fixed idea of where those numbers lie, simply because we have an ordered pattern. We know negative infinity, positive infinity. We know how numbers increase in this space. But if I come to a circle and I tell you that I have observed 30 degrees on a compass, or let's not say compass, that has some form of idea, but if I just give you an observation of 30 degrees and I tell you, okay, here's the circle, go and draw on the circle where 30 degrees lies, right? There are two main aspects that are required for us to be able to go and decide where this observation lies. The first is we need a reference point. At which point on this circle, right, are we starting with our 0 point, right? I can either choose north to be my 0 angle, or I can choose where east is to be the 0 angle, and I can then move 30 degrees from that point. The second idea as well that we need before we can just go and say, okay, I have a reference point, is an orientation. Are we moving clockwise on the circle or anti-clockwise? If I consider east to be my 0 point and I move clockwise, I will get a different response to anti-clockwise. So when we come into this environment of directional statistics, it's also important to consider that when we define our observations, that we define them with respect to a reference point, an origin, as well as with a sense of orientation. There are also properties that we need to consider to ensure that if we change our reference point or our orientation of how our model can adapt to account for these changes in terms of invariance properties, etc. Right. Now, the next question that comes into mind, especially from a statistical side, from being brought up in linear world, is, okay, fine, we have these two elements of a reference point and a sense of orientation. So now that we know that, why can't we just still go and say, okay, we're going to keep this reference point, we can bring everything back to a line, essentially unwrap the circle, and now we have values. I'm going to consider a very simple, basic example to sort of emphasize why other techniques besides those that we know in the linear space are so important. So if we consider a circle, we've chosen north to be our reference point. There's a 0 angle there, right? We're moving in a clockwise rotation, so we've chosen our two elements. Then if I come and define 2 points, pi over 6 and 2i minus pi over 6, and I ask you as the person working with the data, what is the mean? Where can I expect the mean of these observations? Naturally, from just looking at the circle, one would expect to find it between the 2 points, the closest value in between these at a 0 value, right? However, if we go and we just use the arithmetic mean as we're taught, the average of these 2 points, we actually, if you sum these two values and you divide by 2, you get a pi as the answer. So you're actually working at the complete opposite to where you expect the mean to be. However, if we consider the mean within a directional environment, which we refer to as a circular mean direction, then using an adapted form of the arithmetic mean, we actually obtain the answer to be 0 for the mean, which makes intuitive sense in terms of where these observations lie in the space that we're working in. So this idea of the simple mean extends to all other models and all other metrics that we have within the world of statistics. And that is why it is important to consider the space on which we're working and the curvature that is present in the observations. Right. So hopefully I've convinced you that there is a need for something other than linear metrics by this point. And the person who we blame for this discovery, if I can say it that way, I'll come back to that, is Fisher. So the first sort of mention or reference of directional statistics or circular statistics was in the 1950s. And it was a seminal work of Fisher who came and said, he's working on this problem and it's inappropriate for us to just blindly apply these linear techniques. We need to consider the topological framework that we have. We need to consider the curvature of the space that we're working in. And from there, the three godfathers of directional statistics, if I may call them that, which is Fisher, Mardia, and Watson, came and proposed quite a few ideas, quite a few theoretical advancements in developing this field to account for these frameworks, to account for the curvature and the nature of the observations, right? A lot of the early work that is referenced here is very, very theoretical. So if you go to some of these papers, you might not even find an application. It is in a way natural if you have a look at the frameworks that they've proposed, at the computational requirements to go and make use of these models. It is quite a difficulty for back in the day. So what happened then is, because there were all these theoretical advancements and it was extremely difficult to go and actually make use of them and apply them, the field sort of died out again, reaching almost extinction, but sort of simmering in the background. And for almost over a decade, there was nothing. It was as if the field had disappeared completely from scholars' minds. And then in the early 2000s, it sort of revived again. And there are three main contributions to the revival of this field. The one is as a result of two books, textbook styles, that were published by Madhya and Yup, and which is titled Directional Statistics, and the second book is Topics in Circular Statistics by Jamila Madaka and Sen Gupta in the early 2000s, which made people remember that, hi, there's this field that exists. The second main contributor is the recognition and the emphasis from other disciplines, the applied disciplines, where they started noticing that the data that they had, the data that they were working with, was indeed periodic, and the techniques that they were using to explain the patterns in the data did not account for this. So there's a big motivation from the applied sciences to say, we need more techniques, we need more frameworks to account for these observations and the nature of them. And then the last is thanks to technological advances. So thanks to computing powers, thanks to softwares that have been developed, we are now actually able to go back to the papers from 1950 and implement these models as well as newer ones to make use of this technique. Because as you will come to see in a few slides, the spaces that you work on, because of the curvature, because of the topography, the expressions mathematically are extremely difficult to compute. They're extremely difficult to approximate by hand. And we do then really require very good computational resources to implement these sort of structures. Okay. So we spoke of the topography that's required. What does this mean? So the history is there, but where is it taking us? What are we considering when we work within these spaces, within this topological framework? And this is now where I find it particularly more interesting, the field of directional statistics. Nothing against linear statistics. I still teach it, I still work in it, but when you're in the Euclidean space, you have the one space, you have the real line. Yes, you can have the multivariate version thereof, but it's still a line at the end of the day. However, when you're working within directional statistics, you don't just have an option of one space. You have what we refer to as manifolds. So there are various manifolds upon which we define the model, and lucky for us is these manifolds are a result of the data that you have. So given the problem, given the nature of the data, that will inform your choice of manifold. And then depending on the manifold you have, it will inform your choice of how you approach the model building of it. So how do we then consider the manifold based on the data? It is a function of the type of variable that we have as well as the number of variables. So if we're working with a single variable, a univariate problem in statistics, we usually have what we define as a circular variable, and then we are sitting on a circle, so circle manifold. If we have a circular variable that we're interested in, as well as a linear component to it. So we are not only interested in wind direction, but we're interested in modeling both the wind direction and the wind speed. Then we have the manifold of what we refer to as the cylinder, which is the product of the circle and the real line. If we are then considering multiple different circular variables, right? So a multivariate setting, we can also extend the circle to what we will refer to as a polycylindrical manifold, or we can go into only circular variables, only angular observations, but multiple angular variables. And depending again on the structure of the data, depending on how the observation is defined, we can either end up on the natural extension of the circle, which is the sphere or hypersphere, or we can end up on the torus or the p torus for a multiple extension of that. Okay, we'll have a look at a few examples of how these manifolds look and what type of models exist for them as well. So for a univariate circular variable, we work on the circumference of the circle. Our observations lie on the circumference of a unit circle, and this is sort of an illustration of how the data would be if we had to just plot the raw observations. We could also, interestingly, end up with a cardioid. It is also a univariate circle random variable. It's just the manifold differs slightly in terms of its shape due to certain properties that might occur. Right. Again, with a univariate variable, is the one that is more interesting is what we will refer to as axial data. So we mentioned that the observation that we're interested in is an angle, we're interested in its direction. However, we also encounter variables where we're not only interested in the direction it's pointing the line, but we're interested in the entire line as the observation. Because if we have a look at the top part where the line is pointing towards the blue cluster near to 0, and then the line also points towards the bottom blue cluster near 180, what we are saying is that both these clusters represent the exact same point. Right, so it's not necessarily that we're interested in only the direction, but the entire line forms our observation. In this case, we end up with almost an idea of a half circle. Right, but if we just divide the circle in half and cut it, we need to remember that this 270 and this 90 is actually the same point. So the easiest way to think of it is if I have north, south, east, and west at the 0, 180, 90, and 270 points respectively, then north and south are the exact same point, and west and east are the exact same point. So if I consider a half circle, I'm not just excluding points at the bottom, I'm actually rejoining the two. Okay. Popular distributions and models that exist for the circle is the von Mises, which is also referred to as the circular normal. It's analog to the normal distribution, the Gaussian distribution that we all tend to love and go to as our first choice. So that is also the case in circular statistics is we have the von Mises distribution, which we go to as our first choice when we're uncertain. And then there are other distributions as well. There are four main sort of techniques of obtaining circular distributions. The one is in terms of a projection. We have then the projected normal distribution. We have the construction of wrapping a distribution. So it's almost like the idea of taking a piece of string. So you take something that's linear and you fix it at one point and you keep going around and around the circle until your string ends. That is the idea of wrapping, and there's many known wrap distributions that exist. And then the last two is by means of perturbation as well as transformation. But I'm not going to go into detail of that. That's not the fun part yet. Okay. Second manifold, just to get the visual representation, is the sphere, so the natural extension of the circle to higher dimension. Again, well-known models of the von Mises-Fisher, which is again the multivariate normal distributions analog in this directional world, and other popular models like the spherical normal and the Watson and Kent as well. Okay. The more interesting looking shape would be the torus, the product of two circles, which is like a donut shape. Again, we have a multivariate extension of this, which is possible, but in terms of the bivariate case, so two circles, we have the bivariate von Mises, which has representations in terms of sine and cosine parts that can be used, or we have the wrapped bivariate normal distribution, which is also a popular choice. Okay. Coming then to the circle and the line, the cylindrical model, this is sort of the visual illustration of what that is. So the product of a circle and any real line, it could be positive, negative, support, strictly positive. It depends on how you define the model. Popular models that exist are sort of models that have been constructed by means of copulars. So the Johnson and Wiley proposed a very interesting joint circular linear copula, which has been used in a lot of models to obtain, for example, the Abbe-Lee model, which combines a skew version of the von Mises with the Weibull for the linear part to account for sort of extreme tails and extreme behavior in the linear component. And then the last manifold that we're quickly going to have a look at is the disk. So I haven't mentioned the disk as yet. When we define a circular variable, we said we're not, if we define it in terms of a unit vector, we mentioned we're interested in the direction and not necessarily the magnitude. Coming with the disk is we consider both the magnitude and the direction in this case. So we have a linear component as well as a circular component. And instead of the directional observation or the direction lying on the circumference of the circle, we end up having a bounded circle with all the observations within. So we start at the origin of the circle, so sort of in the middle. And then based on that origin, we will move based on the magnitude of the vector in a certain length in the direction of the vector. There are quite nice examples of the disk model. However, because of the restrictions of this disk being a unit radius, it does pose some application challenges in terms of we limit the length or the linear component of an observation to have a maximum length of 1, which is not ideal if we think of wind direction and wind speed or certain other applications. Where the disk does come in handy is if we're, for example, interested in animal movement and we have a bounded space where we know the boundary within which we're working, then we can always rescale the observation so that we have a unit length, and in that case, it is a viable manifold to work on. Okay, so since this colloquium is for NITheCS, I thought it would be interesting to add some examples within the different focus area and the different application domains of where directional statistics has actually been applied. There are examples. These ones specifically are from papers within the statistics communities. Some of them are from the 1950s papers examples, but there have been applications within the various focus areas within NITheCS, which I think was quite interesting. I do want to add the disclaimer that I understand the manifold, right? I'll just go back, sorry. I understand the manifold. The type and application, I'm assuming that those who are within these focus area will have a better understanding of that. But it does exist within astronomy, astrophysics, looking at star constellations and things like that. There've been some interesting applications, galaxy spin orientations, etc., for the different manifolds, all considering these form of applications. If you are within bioinformatics and biology, again, some very interesting examples, specifically within protein structures, protein geometry. There's a lot of interesting work. The protein structures are usually with the manifold of a torus, where they're interested in the dihedral angles of these protein structures. Just out of interest, I did not know this until last year, but I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with AlphaFold, the protein sort of, they won one of the Nobel Prizes, the chemist who worked on this problem. And the current version that's being used, of course, is not the first version that was developed, but one of the original versions of AlphaFold that was developed was based on a probabilistic framework. And within that probabilistic framework, they actually included directional statistics models that were defined on a torus for the protein structures angle. So I thought that was quite interesting coming from this field. But yes, so a lot of work in this. Earth systems and climate, again, you will see quite a few of the selected contributions that I look at. We focus a lot on wind. It is quite an area of interest in many applications. So there's those. Theoretical physics, again, please only ask me about the manifold. But there are a few works that I thought was quite interesting within this area as well that contained some use and some models from the directional statistics frameworks. Okay. Right. Then coming now to some of the work that I've had the privilege of being part of. And I'm not going to go into too much detail into each of these. It's more just a short overview, a short idea of what the work that I've been looking at does. And if there is any interest in terms of any data problems that you are working with that you think maybe it needs a directional point of view, then at least you can see some of the stuff that is being done and hopefully reach out and we can do something interesting. So the first problem that I want to discuss that we had a look at, again, this one is a project that is very special and near to my heart. And the reason being is that it was completely unexpected how it came about. So we worked in a very fun team. We had Prof. Peter Leroux from the University of Pretoria, Janine Scumbi as well. Prof. Leroux is in the plant and soil sciences department, and he approached us saying, I've seen you guys did some work in directional statistics. I think I have this data, it's directional. Can you do something fun with it? This is the question I want to answer. And when he asked us the question, we thought it was simple enough. He just wanted to know, they have these scoria cones, which we'll have a look at. So on the island of Marion Island. So Marion Island is part of the Prince Edward Island family. It's owned by South Africa. Further south after the point of Cape Town. And they have these little sort of volcanic sources that were deposited from thousands of years ago. And they formed these cones on the island. And on these cones, vegetation started growing. There's very specific types, but they wanted to know if the growth pattern of these vegetation on the cone was essentially influenced by the wind. And why specifically the wind? So Marion Island is a great resource for research because it has not been yet destroyed by humans. Right. Besides researchers, no one really lives there continuously. And one of the great things about Marion Island is it has very consistent westerly wind, very dominant, very strong westerly wind patterns, which have been studied quite a bit. And they know that there is this influence of wind on the island, and they just want to know, okay, does this wind cause the stripes to have, the vegetation to have these certain stripe patterns? So simple problem enough, wind versus stripes. How complicated could it get, right? And the following work came about where we looked at this idea of modeling these two elements. Now, the first point that struck out as an interesting realization during this project is, yes, we know wind direction, it's circular, we're on the circle, but these vegetation stripes that we have, they're not a linear variable. How do we consider the stripe? They're not a circle either. And they're what we refer to as the axial data. So that's why I mentioned the axial specifically earlier on, is because the stripe is essentially a line. It's an axis that we're interested in. And the question came in, okay, what models exist, or how can we jointly model this axial variable, this stripe of the vegetation versus the wind? Okay. And then the second thing that came about as we were sort of initially looking at the data is we seen that there were sort of these little clusters, or there was some heterogeneity in terms of the behavior of the stripe and wind. So we wanted to then go and see, okay, not only do we want to see the effect of wind on the stripe, but we also want to be able to, in a way, isolate these different clusters and try and see, okay, are there certain regions on the island or certain experiences in terms of other factors influencing that cause the stripes to have a certain pattern? And interestingly enough, for the first problem that we faced in terms of can we jointly model this circular and axial variable, it surprised us to know that there is very, very limited work that has been done on axial data. There are two well-known models that are used, and that is sort of where it's at. Coming to the joint modeling, as we said, very limited. There's only two models that exist from a probabilistic point of view, a parametric point of view, for this axial data, and no one's actually considered jointly modeling these variables. So that came to the first problem of, okay, how can we now jointly model these two variables? And once we've jointly modeled them, how can we then also consider the heterogeneity in the data? So what we ended up doing is, or before I get to what we ended up doing, is the data itself. So just so that we know and can picture what the cones are, what the wind and stripes look like. So we have a picture of Marion Island. This is the actual island itself. And these little bumps, I'm not sure if you can see them on the island, those are the cones that have been formed. Right, so there's these little dots, essentially. Those are all the cones on the island. And we have these little green stripy lines that are a very mock-up illustration of what the stripes on the cones look like. And we know the cones are round, so what we considered as well, which is something that will come up in, is we just considered dividing the cone into four. So we considered four aspects of this cone, and we'll see why we divided it up into aspects in a little bit. But we considered the cone, divided it in four, had a look in each of the quadrants what's going on. There were certain cones where we couldn't use all the information and where we couldn't extract certain data for it. But what we ended up with was a sample of 133 stripes. Again, these are axial variables or axial data. So the range of this variable in terms of the values it takes on is between 0 and pi, the half circle idea. What we also had, and what made the study that much more interesting, is in terms of wind direction, this is the first study to make use of surface level wind data. So we were extremely lucky in that Prof. Leroux had worked previously on a project to build a computational fluids dynamic model in order to obtain surface level wind data for the island itself. And previous studies that sort of hypothesized on the vegetation stripes and the wind direction, they didn't actually have any accurate wind representation for these cones. So we were lucky enough to make use of this surface level data at the point in the cone, and we also isolated it to the aspect. So when we divided the cone into 4, what was the wind experience on that particular aspect of the cone? And as we've mentioned previously, wind direction is a circular variable, so we have a range of 0 to 2 pi. Okay. Now, the proposed model, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I am a mathematical statistician, so there has to be some formulas somewhere in a presentation. But this is essentially the approach we followed, and we considered developing a joint model using copulars. So this is a bit not so fun. The results are more fun. Right. So if we consider these variables of the vegetation stripe and the wind direction, if we just look at them individually, again, we can see heterogeneity in the behavior. So we have multiple modes here, again, for the wind direction as well. So the stripes have multiple modes, wind direction. And then if we come to the plot of considering the joint point, so the wind direction versus the stripe, we went and we colored the points based on the aspect. So based on in which quadrant the point fell in, we wanted to see if it makes a difference if the point was always in the northeasterly corner of the cone versus the southwesterly or something of that form. And then also just to help us get a better idea, if we want to know the stripe pattern, right? We know that there is going to be some influence of other factors, for example, gravitational pull or something like that. So in this plot, we just added the slope, and in our model, when we considered the heterogeneity of the observations in these clusters, we used slope and the aspect as indicators. So we can see here from the little scatter plot that we do sort of see these two little clusters that occur, the one sort of more with the north to east, and here at the bottom between west and north in terms of the direction. So we see that there are definitely some patterns forming from just the slope and the aspect. Okay. Coming then to our model, what we ended up doing is we defined a joint model for the circle and the axial using a copular approach. And then for the heterogeneity in the data, we considered a mixture model idea. So the mixture model just essentially allows us to get these clusters or these classes that we refer to account for the different behavior that we're observing. And we went and had a look at varying numbers of clusters, varying numbers of groups to see what's happening in the data. And interestingly enough, 3 clusters for this data ended up being the most accurate model in explaining the behavior. So we have class 1, class 2, class 3. And now a question that comes in is if we have a look at these red points here at the end, right? They sort of seem displaced, right? They're randomly there. If we just quickly have a look, we'd probably think that, oh, they're outliers or something of that form. But because we are working on a circular manifold, when we have a look at this plot, we actually need to, on the x-axis, consider this origin point S and this as the same. So when you picture it in your mind, you actually need to fold the graph so that the 2 endpoints meet up. So this point here on the graph and this point is the same. So these red values are not actually outliers. They join over here on this side. They're just a little bit more on this side out. So that's the interesting thing, is remember we're working on this loop essentially. So when we picture it in our mind, it loops. The same thing for the y-axis. This east and this west are the same point. It's an axial variable. So when we picture it in terms of the y-axis, we also need to fold it over on the y-axis and the z-axis. So these points that are here are actually very close to these points that are there in orange. So if we have a look at the black, red, and yellow dots, we can actually see the 3 clusters defined. The yellow clusters, these points actually join on at the bottom there if we shift the graph up. Right. Now, it's great that we have this point, but what can we actually see from it? So if we go and we condition and say, okay, based on these 3 clusters that we're observing, what do we come to find out? So the top panels indicate the wind speed direction, and the bottom panels indicate the stripe. So for cluster 1, essentially what we are saying for the influence of wind on the stripe is that if this particular stripe falls within cluster 1, and we can go and have a look at what aspect and slope, etc., relate to cluster 1, right? We're saying that cluster 1 experiences a more westerly, little bit of southwesterly wind, and the stripes are southwesterly orientated. Whereas in group 2, the wind is more exactly southwesterly, so it doesn't deviate towards the westerly direction as much. And in this case, the stripes are closer to a southern orientation. And lastly, for the third cluster, we have a more westerly wind moving towards northwesterly. And in this case, our stripes are actually lying horizontal between west and east. All right, so we have these 3 patterns that we can define the experience of the wave versus the stripe from this model. Okay, so this is sort of where we got to, and we were able to explain the different behavior within the project and that. Further work on this is also being done in order to predict how we can, if a cone or a particular stripe will grow in a certain orientation or axes as well. The second study is slightly different from the domain we were working in, and this is within the biomechanical domain, so an orthopedic example. Again, unexpected in terms of we had a discussion with a mechanical engineer and an orthopedic clinician, and they were working on this problem, and they said, okay, what can we get from here? And the background for this is essentially in terms of optimizing or patient care. So an external fixator, which is this device, or I like to refer to it as a steel contraption thing, is a device that's placed on a person who's broken a bone. So easiest to think of it is if you break your leg bone, full break, complete break, right? You go to the doctor, they're going to place this device on your leg, right? They screw it in, there's screws and wires and nails and all these things that go in to basically keep the bone in place so that it can heal. When this device is placed on a person, they become immobile. So it's not that you're going to find people walking around with this device in the NITheCS Center. Right. So the idea is that this device needs to be such, the configuration of it, meaning the combination of the way the wires, the nails, the screws all interact, such that it can optimize healing, but also allow for some flexibility, because we know that we are mobile people. After the recovery, after the bone has been regrows, we know we want the person to be able to place a load on that leg, to be able to walk, to move, to turn, things like that. So the device is such that it allows for some flexibility, but we also need to make sure that it doesn't allow for the bone to re-snap. Right. So what happens is the distance or the place here, this is essentially where the bone has broken. So you'll see there's a gap there, right? And the device is placed on. And so we have what we refer to as a reference position. So that's in a still position. And what they do with this device when they test it is, as if a human is going to now stand on the leg, they place different loads in a simulated environment on this device to come and see, okay, if they place 10 kilos or something on it, what is the movement going to be of these 2 ends where the breakage has occurred, right? And that displacement in terms of the reference position, the still position, versus now the deflected position with the load placed on, all right, those are the displacements that we were interested in modeling. There are 6 types of displacements that end up being recorded. 3 of them are translational. So we have in terms of an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis, right, versus the reference position, translational, so linear variables. And then there are 3 types of rotational displacements that occur in terms of the torsion and things like that. So we have 3 circular variables and 3 linear variables that we would like to model jointly. And that was the idea of this experiment and the data that they had. And what they were interested in is there are what we refer to in this area as benchmark configurations. They wanted to know, as if a manufacturer comes and adds on a new configuration, how much does this configuration differ from the benchmark? Is it a good addition? Is it a bad addition? Is it more stable? Will it optimize healing better? And what is the behavioral pattern, essentially, of this new configuration of wires and screws? So we had a look at the literature to say, okay, what's happening in this field? And the first thing we noticed was that mostly all the studies within this area considered all 6 of these displacements to be independent random variables. Now, just by looking at this device, you can imagine that there is probably some relationship between the movement in the y-axis and the x-axis when a load is placed on this device, right? So that was the first assumption that seemed a little bit odd to us. And then the second assumption is you have 3 rotational variables, 3 rotational displacements that are being recorded, and they all just ignored the periodicity of it. So we had to come and say, okay, how can we find a way or a model to account for all 6 variables, 3 being linear, 3 being directional? So we want a joint model with a dependency structure as well. And this led to joint work with Dr. Kojakis Kat, who is a mechanical engineer on this project, and then Dr. Annette Christie Barnard, who was our orthopedic clinician, to come and tell us, okay, when we consider the interaction and the behavior of these variables, what should we consider as important? What should we consider as influences or other factors that have a role to play in us interpreting these displacements? And we were able to construct a very interesting model, again by means of copulas, but vine copulas in this case, to jointly model this structure and obtain some results related to, firstly, the independence assumption. So we went to go make sure, if we test this assumption of considering independent random variables, is it sufficient? Can we just ignore a joint model? And secondly, if we consider the variables to be linear, is there actually any merit to it in this example? And the results can be found in the article in SMR. Fine copula structure, we can skip that. Then the next contributions are all related to wind data. So I mentioned in the beginning that wind is quite a popular application within this field just because of the nature of the data. There's a lot of wind data. Wind is of interest not only for climate change, but also wind energy farms and things like that. So it is quite a nice variable or nice data to work with. And this was some of the initial studies we had a look at, where we considered wind modeling and wind energy. The wind modeling we considered on Marion Island. So this was the project we did before the cones and the vegetation stripes. And from this study, I can definitely confirm that Marion Island does have a very strong westerly wind pattern. So we assumed that to be known and true when we did the vegetation stripes study. But and then the second study that we did in the same modeling framework was for wind energy, and we had a look at the wind power output and the wind power densities. In both these cases, we were interested in, both these studies emanated more from a theoretical interest in terms of the disk manifold. We were fascinated with this manifold and we wanted to see, okay, what else can we do with this manifold? So these 2 studies are a product of that, where we defined a new model on a disk, which we referred to as a general class of Mobius distributions on the disk. And we were able to then make use of this to firstly model wind and direction and wind speed. And then we will also be able to use this to generalize it within a wind power density function for wind energy studies as well. Right. Just going to skip through this, but the cone-like structure, this is essentially the density that we ended up estimating for the wind energy. Again, you can see here with the wind energy, if we have a look at the rose diagram, a lot of the data that we experience within directional statistics is not homogeneous. So again, here we had some heterogeneity, and luckily our model was such that it accounted for multimodality in this case. Okay. Last but not least is a lot of the models we had a look at up to now were all probabilistic models, and we were interested in understanding the patterns of certain things. However, within the world of directional statistics, it is also possible for us to consider linear examples when we would like to explain a response with a set of covariates or perform prediction of that sort. We are fortunate in directional statistics to not only have one regression, but 3 regressions. Why 3? It all depends on what the nature of our response is and our covariates. So if we consider a regression exercise where our response is an angular observation, we end up with and our covariate set, is linear, we end up with a circular linear regression. If we have a regression exercise where our response is linear, but our covariate sets include some directional observations, we have a linear circular regression. And then we also have when our covariate set and our response are both circular, and we have circular regression. So again, depending on the nature of the observations, we have these sort of models that we can use. And we also had a look at some wind energy studies for Beaufort West, which is in a local example of being able to predict the wind direction, and this is important for wind farm optimizations, right? The layout of a wind farm for wind energy production, they need to know what direction is best to face these wind turbines to optimize the energy output. So we had a look at that example. We also then, from a regression point of view, considered air pollution as a study. So within an environmental context, we know that air pollution is a function of wind both in terms of the direction and the speed. So in this case, we were able to consider both wind speed and wind direction in an air pollution regression function. And we also added some additional methodology in this in terms of variable selection within this circular framework, as well as improving predictive performance. Right. So main takeaways is directional statistics is essentially an extension or an adaptation of the linear techniques that we know and have to account for the topology on which we're working out, the nature of the space that our model is defined on. Most important thing is the data that you have informs your choice of manifold, and then your manifold informs the choice of your models that you're going to define. The applications, as we've seen, span mostly all domains that are there, specifically within the sciences, and that is a lot of the data that we get and the inspiration we get is from data from the fields within the sciences of new models that we can have a look at. My particular preference is a new statistical methodology and frameworks that we can possibly develop for problems that are of interest to a particular domain. So most of the projects that you've seen, the vegetation stripes, the biomechanical study, they've been interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary projects where we both ended up being able to contribute towards the fields we're working in, and we had fun doing so. I think we had fun doing so. Right. And then the last point just is we know that data is abundant. We've been saying that for the past decade, and more so non-Euclidean data. So this directional, these orientational observations, they have always been there, but they are definitely there, more so there now, and they're being identified as directional, as periodic in nature. So there is definitely an increasing need for directional statistics techniques and frameworks. within this context. So there is still a lot of work that is being done, that a lot of scope for new methods, new frameworks to be developed, especially because if you look at the history of directional statistics, it started much later than linear statistics. It had the lull over a decade where nothing really new was done. So it is a little behind in terms of methodologies and frameworks than a linear statistics, which just means that there's more opportunity for us to explore ideas. And then some publicity, just a little bit, is I'm very excited, and hopefully within the next 3 months, this will be publicly available. I'm one of the co-editors of a book by Taylor and Francis titled Environmental Modeling with Contemporary Statistics. And the reason it's also relevant to my talk today is the book is based on 3 pillars or 3 sections, and the one being sort of supervised, unsupervised learning. The second pillar being directional statistics, as we've mentioned in this presentation, that there's a lot of application within environmental context for directional statistics. So there's a lot of innovations happening in this framework. And then lastly, the third pillar of space-time dynamics. So please be on the lookout for this. There's some really great international leaders and experts in this environmental statistics framework that we have invited to contribute to this edited volume. So we are really looking forward for the audience to read the chapters. I know I was very excited when I read the chapters. So I think it's going to be a great book. And then last but not least is as much as academia has the idea of being lone wolves in isolation in silos, I've been very fortunate to have great collaborators and a lot of teamwork on the projects that I've been involved in. So these are just most of the collaborators that we've had, some collaborators, some friends, some people that inspired my work in directional statistics as well, I've had the privilege of either them visiting me here in Stellenbosch or the opportunity to go and spend some time with them in the last few years. And then for those who are interested, these are the places I would start with some background or some guidance on what to consider as my manifold of choice based on the data I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Priyanka, for the great talk. Do we have questions for Priyanka? Yeah, Zura, I know I can count on you. Here we go.
Thank you very much for introducing us to a very interesting topic. Do you ever encounter situations where you have to transport your data from one manifold to another, or maybe reconfigure on your manifold by some transformation of endotransformation of the manifold? So basically, very vaguely, my question is: do you ever encounter a situation when you need to consider mappings between manifolds, either between different manifolds or one manifold itself?
Okay. So not necessarily mappings between different manifolds, because remember the manifold is a result of the nature of the data, right? So if you have data that's circle or product or multivariate circle, you're not necessarily going to map that onto a different structure. However, there are mappings of certain manifolds onto different spaces. So there is the mapping of the sphere onto a tangent space, so that we sort of have this projection onto a space that's linear, where we can do certain calculations and then map back to the sphere. So there's the log transform and the exponential mapping transform that we use for tangent space projections. There are certain models within the framework that's also been derived and constructed using a mapping of the manifold to itself. So transformations or mappings like the Mobius transform is quite a popular choice for transformation within the space. So the Mobius the distribution on the disk, for example, that was constructed by using a disk and mapping it onto itself with this transformation, so that the new derived model can account for skewness, for example. So even within the circle. So we know the idea of wrapping wraps a line, as we like to call it, on a circle, but you can wrap a circle on a circle. So there are those cases, but I haven't personally come across or seen anything where you map a sphere onto a torus or something like that. Those are a little bit more.
So one place where I could have imagined that you would have to map from one manifold to another is where maybe the way you gather data kind of forces some structure, but you know that in reality the structure should be different, and then you try to kind of map it back to what the real structure would have been of the data. So maybe the way you gather data is you got some stations that kind of gather data, but it only gives you a kind of projection of what the actual data should have been. And so maybe kind of to correct the just fantasizing now.
I'm not entirely sure. I would assume that you would start with the corrected manifold.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Yeah. Santa.
Thanks, Priyanka, for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. How do you deal with the age-old issue of causation versus correlation in ecology? So how did you isolate wind direction as a causal factor and not simply correlate? Considering that you mentioned that it's been the prevailing wind direction for so many years, that there could be other issues underlying that. Did you take any of that into account when you looked at the science?
Yes. So within the adapted metrics and framework of directional statistics, there's also an adapted version of a correlation. So in Mardia's book, the 2001 Directional Statistics, he quite nicely shows how we can define the correlation between a linear and a circular variable, or a circular and a circular variable, to identify a statistical dependency versus yeah. So when we say that there is a relationship or a dependency, it's from a statistical dependency.
Questions? Do we have questions from the online people? Let me quickly. We don't have any questions. There are no questions.
Thanks.
Okay, then Priyanka, thank you very much again, also for addressing almost all the NITheCS disciplines. Thank you very much. That was really nice.
Thank you.
And according to plan, there should be some snacks and drinks outside, and that's also a directional problem because you have to go out the way you came in and not through here. So thank you very much, Priyanka, again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I always forget that even you.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.